Yes, definitely there will be a hydrogen economy. I'm absolutely convinced about that, with a completely different cost situation that we see today. The problem is a little bit, how do we get there?
A net zero world would require 306 million tons of green hydrogen to be produced annually by 2050, according to the International Energy Agency. That in turn would require something in the region of 3,000 gigawatt of electrolysers and the double amount, 6,000 gigawatt of renewable energy based on current technology. That is a fairly tall order. Now, based on the notion that economies of scale would reduce the cost of green hydrogen production, several developers have announced massive and extremely ambitious projects that aim to meet much of the world's future demand for clean H2. In this episode, we'll give that a fact check. What is the current situation? Is the strong expansion of green hydrogen projects succeeding worldwide? And do we even need them for a sustainable, future-proof energy industry? Stay tuned and you'll find out. Welcome yet again to our yearly special mini-series of the Smarter E podcast, recorded live here in Munich during the Smarter E conference and exhibition 2024. We made sure to get some of the most interesting international experts and industry representatives and talk to them about the most exciting trends and developments while creating the renewable energy system of the future. My guest for this episode, Thomas Hillig, is an absolute expert for all things hydrogen and founder of THEnergy, a premier boutique consultancy specializing in innovative renewable energy solutions. He's also a known industry influencer and hence quite busy here at the Smarter E Europe conference, making his own interviews, so I'm quite fortunate to have caught him during one of his breaks. Welcome, Thomas.
Thank you very much for having me, Zach.
And now, Thomas, you're a neutral expert on the topic because you don't have any technology to sell yourself, so I'm expecting a frank assessment. When we talk about hydrogen, we always talk about gigawatt projects. It's almost like typical startup claims, always revolutionizing an industry, always in the gigasphere out there. So is that actually true, honest, grounded numbers, or are we in the realm of fiction there?
Green hydrogen is still very expensive. So everyone who wants to come up with a good business case needs big numbers. So they need economies of scale to come up with acceptable prices for green hydrogen. This is why there are so many press announcements for projects that involve gigawatt production capacity. At the same time, we at THEnergy, we release pretty often, twice, 3 times a year, a green hydrogen map of electrolyzers that are running, that have been installed, that were commissioned actually in Europe. And this map actually gives a completely different view on the market situation. In Europe, still the biggest electrolyzer has a capacity of just 20 megawatt and not of something like 2 gigawatt. There are still 2 different worlds. There is the world of the announcement game, driven actually by this need for low cost of electrolyzers, of hydrogen, and then there's the reality which is moving at a completely different pace.
Now that's quite a divide, quite a big gap to bridge, to be honest. Now I understand that, of course, in order to attract investors, and especially in that realm, it's VC, it's risk investors. But on the other hand, you also want to be, of course, profitable on the long term. So if you look at those 2 ends where we are now, where we need to be, can hydrogen actually be economically viable in the long term?
Yes. So if we manage to come up with these cumulated production volumes, question is a little bit, will it be like in solar that we start with smaller projects, the project size is growing steadily, and then afterwards also large and huge projects will be realized? Actually, the cost regression works on cumulated electrolyzer production capacity, not on the size of an individual project. There is also an effect if we do not have large projects, but many, many small projects on the cost side. So in the end, then electrolyzer manufacturers will automate their production, for example. This will bring costs down, just as an example. So yes, definitely there will be a hydrogen economy. I'm absolutely convinced about that. with a completely different cost situation that we see today. The problem is a little bit, how do we get there? Do we get there with one huge project? I have my question marks. I don't think so. The only project I'm seeing that is actually not in Europe, that is in Saudi Arabia, NEOM. This is really a gigawatt project that is being started. It's a little bit out of this normal market mechanism because it's financed in the end by the government, and it does not rely on private financing. So this could already drive the cost curve down to quite some extent. And then in Europe, we are a little bit more at this post-pilot project stage, I would say, where we are not building some smaller lab electrolyzers, but this 5, 10, 15, 20 megawatt electrolyzers. And as I said, this is already helping us to drive the costs down.
All right, that was quite a firm yes that you started your answer with. But then again, why are so few projects being realized at the moment? As you mentioned, you were only able to name one huge project, the one in NEOM.
I could name all the projects from our electrolyzer map. That would not be a problem. And 20 megawatt is not that small either, to be honest here. The large ones, who really is investing into a project? So let's pick one in Namibia. If we talk in Namibia about a project of a couple of gigawatts, it could make up to 20-30% of the GDP of the country in general. So then you run into circumstances where country risks actually play a major role in these areas where you have very good production capacity, for example. It could work if the German government, for example, takes over the risk. So it is feasible, but does it really make sense to build in these locations projects that are this big? Personally, I have a question mark. And I think what we've seen in the solar sector also makes sense to some extent, just to scale up the project size slowly. Problem is, then small electrolyzers, relatively high costs of hydrogen per kilogram, and someone has to pay for this price gap. And as for all new technologies, there are subsidies, there are different incentives. For example, in Europe, we have the European Hydrogen Bank that is bridging a certain gap for production within Europe. In Germany, you have something very similar. And they are also establishing mechanisms for bridging the gap for hydrogen that is imported actually from outside the EU.
Now, what's very interesting here as a spontaneous follow-up question is that it sounds to me like it's a technology that really needs big investors being willing to go into risky investments, and also state actors to be willing to subsidize the beginning. Now, specifically, that is not something that Europe as such is very good at compared, for example, to the US or China. Is that a disadvantage for the local hydrogen economy?
I don't fully agree. If we look at the market side, for example, to a large extent it has been Germany. It was Germany who actually put up the feed-in tariff to grow the market. Sometimes, if we look back here 15 years ago, 2009, 2010, when we had the solar boom in Germany, the global market sometimes was 50% just of the global market was the German market. So on the market side, I think we are not that bad. If we are really good at supporting our industry, that it will be actually the European players who will manufacture the electrolyzers in the end. In the solar, if we have a look at the solar industry, we were definitely not that good. In the US, of course, they have with the IRA right now a mechanism which is very simple, which could speed up things over there considerably. Could be even that we are buying then in the end if they establish a good industry, the material from the US and not from China anymore. But having a look at the cost position, I think the natural manufacturer of electrolyzers, if we do not say in Germany, we absolutely want to have our own supply chain, and that we don't want to do the mistake of Russian gas again, that we just rely on one player and that we subsidize this to a certain extent, then I think in the end we would run into a very similar situation, probably not importing electrolyzers from the US, but rather again from China.
Now, what's interesting that in your answer, actually, you made a reference to some smart policies when it comes to the ramp up of solar and PV here in Europe or in Germany. Is hydrogen in a comparable spot to where solar was 15 years ago?
If we don't talk only about regulation here, just comparing the complexity of a hydrogen economy and starting this hydrogen economy in comparison to solar and ramping up solar cells, or solar module cells, In the end, if we have a merit order curve, then 15 years ago, it was the logic thing just to put a little bit of solar energy into our markets so that you did not have to do much. In the end, our electricity systems, our energy systems could absorb easily this share of solar energy, a relatively low share of solar energy. For hydrogen, it looks a little bit different. There we have two different segments, I would say, or for green hydrogen. We have a segment that absolutely requires hydrogen, and that is actually fueled by grey hydrogen, so fossil fuel-based hydrogen today. Then we just have to replace this grey hydrogen by green hydrogen. It's a relatively easy task. A much more complex segment is where we actually rely today on natural gas, for example, for industrial processes, and have to replace these processes and run these processes right now on green hydrogen, because it's not replacing natural gas one-to-one by green hydrogen. Let me give you one example that undermines this complexity, which is much bigger than what we've seen in the solar industry 15 years ago, where we were just dumping in the end solar energy into the market and we did not care about the market at all. And there the feed-in tariffs were the right incentives. My example for hydrogen at the moment is, let's have a look at the glass industry. There, for the ovens, you burn actually natural gas and you come up with a certain temperature for melting the glass. If you replace right now, just without fine-tuning, the natural gas by hydrogen, the glass in the end would not be transparent anymore because hydrogen burns at a different temperature. So it's not just about replacing electricity from coal-fired power plants by solar energy, but here we really have to do work on the processes. And so the whole situation is much more complex than what we were seeing 15 years ago. So the challenge of setting up a hydrogen economy is so much bigger. Also, regarding transportation, for example, right now there is no good infrastructure for transporting green hydrogen. When we say, okay, Namibia, we will import green hydrogen from Namibia, how will we import it? Will we build a pipeline? Do we convert hydrogen to ammonia to transport it to Europe? How will it come to the factories then here? So the situation, unfortunately, is not comparable at all. And also, if we talk about these relatively easy solutions, if we think how to decarbonize quickly, it's a cost question normally. So where do we have maybe even a better cost position for renewable solutions or for green solutions, or where is the cost gap relatively low? And replacing grey hydrogen by green hydrogen at the moment is very, very expensive, and even more expensive than when we were referring to solar 15 years ago.
So sounds to me like a complex undertaking, and hence it cannot really be compared to the situation of PV 15 years ago. Now, hearing this, it sounds like there's a lot still to be figured out. So does it actually make sense to, in the here and now, invest into these large gigawatt projects if there's so many details still in the unclear?
I absolutely agree. So it makes sense that we at the moment go for smaller electrolyzers and actually fine-tune the applications afterwards so that when it makes from a cost position sense in the future that we don't have to start, okay, we don't have hydrogen trucks at the moment, we have to develop hydrogen trucks, for example, or our glass is not transparent if we switch to hydrogen, let's develop this. So I think we have to do hydrogen right now, even if there's no business case, that when in this merit order effect, it's the turn for green hydrogen, that we don't lose time again, and that we have to develop applications in 20 years.
With so many things still having to be developed, are there actually some promising applications for hydrogen in the here and now already? Are there some sort of low-hanging fruits for green hydrogen?
In certain industries, there is actually a premium for green hydrogen in the market. For example, manufacturers of green steel say that the demand for green steel is substantial, that they can sell steel at a premium in the market. And this is partly driven by electric cars and the decarbonization of the whole value chain of e-cars. And then to be coherent and to fulfill the climate goals for a car, actually you also have to look what are the main components, and these are steel. And actually if you break this down to an individual cars, we are not talking about premium on a car level of thousands of euros, it's much less. And e-car manufacturers at the moment are paying this premium. So there the market is already one step further and has established a second segment, a second niche, or there is price differentiation. If we have a look, for example, at fertilizers, it looks promising. There we also need huge amounts of hydrogen. But then on the agricultural side, I don't see the same offtake at the moment. But this could be also a segment that could break through pretty quickly. Transportation, trucks, more and more trucks are developed by the big manufacturers for long-distance transportation, for example.
Though if I may jump right in here, with trucks, for example, I heard some high-level managers of MAN talking about hydrogen trucks making up for maximum 15% of their fleets in the future. So it doesn't seem to be the big case that some lobbyists argue for, but it might be a great case for hydrogen nevertheless.
I think this also depends. If we have a fully established hydrogen economy where you can actually transport green hydrogen to the individual refueling station, then the cost position is a completely different one. And also, for battery e-mobility, I live in downtown Munich. I still have to look sometimes for 2 hours to get a charger in downtown Munich. And if I had the chance to buy right now a hydrogen car, I think I would even pay more than for a battery electric. But of course, also the battery electric car infrastructure, EV charging will mature. And let's see where we are there in 10 years. It's very important not to compare apples and oranges.
Now that was your very subjective experience from, funnily enough, Munich, right here where we are recording this podcast. How representative do you think is that of market predictions?
I think we are here talking about a small segment actually, maybe 10% of inner city people who do not have access to real private charging, who have to charge their car in public. And for example, in Munich, I would not even say it is only a charging problem, it's a parking problem in the end. So I have to look then in the end at the moment 3 times for a parking lot. If there is no access to an EV charger, I have to park the car somewhere else. Then afterwards I have to look for parking space at the EV charger. And afterwards I have to remove the car again and look for another parking space. So it's also a little bit the bigger context here. And if you go to a fueling station, then you don't have this problem.
A lot of nitty-gritty details to be still figured out. Now, you mentioned, nevertheless, we should really start investing in hydrogen on a larger scale because we really need to get going. Now, where do you see all that green hydrogen being produced? You mentioned Namibia a couple of times. You mentioned NEOM. Are those the regions that you think are the most favorable, or some others that still need to be mentioned?
I think we also will see a substantial green hydrogen production in Europe. Government plans at the moment are even to produce something like almost 50% of the green hydrogen in Germany in the future. And I think that Spain within Europe has a huge potential. I think in the end, investment certainty will play a key role in the future, and also access to pipelines. So from Spain, we will have very easily, or in the nearer future, access to good pipelines that will run into Germany. So I think Europe, and then the ideal locations in general that we could imagine when we just figure out where do we have good wind and solar resources at the same time, and probably need tankers. We need to reconvert then hydrogen to ammonia and import hydrogen in ships.
Now that's good news. That sounds like in Europe we might even get some small or considerable size of the pie that's being distributed when it comes to hydrogen production. If we go a step back, what opportunities do you think Europe could seize in terms of hydrogen electrolyzers and the production of these?
There I would expect a very similar development as we've seen for solar modules, also for batteries, unless Europe really decides to support the domestic production of this equipment in Europe. If there's a political will, actually not to rely completely on China, on the supply chain, but I think it will be always more expensive to produce the equipment in Europe. For example, we have higher environmental standards, and it's also a question, do we want to produce in this black box China? And also, we have to be honest, electrolyzer production will be subsidized in China. So it would be to some extent also a level playing field if we subsidize the production here. But I'm not completely convinced that there is this determination within the policymakers in Europe.
If we go even one more step further back, what opportunities do we have then for the equipment manufacturers? For the equipment necessary to produce electrolyzers. Is that at least a market we could play a role in, or do you think that's also something that will be covered by China?
Yeah, it's not real rocket science, I would say. First of all, to produce an electrolyzer, it's rather low tech. If it really comes then to improve the automation process, yes, I think there is a chance for European companies. If we have a look at the resource side, this is of course something where Europe will struggle because we don't have access to good resources that are needed to produce the equipment.
Well, to be honest, that's quite some sobering insights here towards near the end of the podcast. Maybe in order to finish on a high note, what excites you personally the most? Which developments are you looking most forward to in the near future, in the next months to come when we're talking about green hydrogen?
I think there will be some interesting projects that are being commissioned on the application side. And also the efficiency of electrolyzers is increasing. Here we are not really speaking about the next month, it's more the next years. At the moment, the efficiency of the electrolysis process is still at 60% or below 60%, but there are manufacturers who are claiming 90% plus in 10-20 years.
Wow, 90% plus, that would really be something quite impressive. Thanks so much, Thomas, for joining me here today live at the Smarter E Conference Europe in Munich in June. Great to have you on the podcast.
Thank you very much, Zach.
Make sure to also check out all the other episodes of our special mini-series recorded live here in Munich during the Smarter E Europe Conference and Exhibition. And even better, join us for the Smarter E Europe in 2025. More information on thesmartere.de. Looking forward to meeting you.